Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk with our guest, Ruth Boreham. Our speaker tonight is making her second appearance with us, although her first online. Many will remember Ruth's presentation back in January 2020 on the Women's Land Army, one of our last meetings before lockdown struck. I said during the introduction then that one day we would perhaps learn of her work on the popular TV series Who Do You Think You Are? And here we are. Ruth completed her education at the University of Leicester, securing a BA in History, and moved to Edinburgh, where she currently works for the Scottish Book Trust on the Book Bug programme for early years children. Alongside this, Ruth is also a tour guide, a tutor, and researcher, although COVID has put paid to most of that work at the moment, and in the past has worked at the National Library of Scotland on the John Murray archive. Ruth loves to share her passion for history with people through talks like this, or through opportunities for television, such as the period when working as an independent researcher for Who Do You Think You Are? Outside of work, Ruth has made a number of trips to Nepal and plans another when circumstances allow. Meantime, she is still slowly working on her biography of Mary Somerville, a 19th century scientist from Burnt Island, which she hopes to finish one day. Before I hand over, just to let you know that Ruth will display her email address at the beginning and at the end of her talk, so you could take a note of that if you want to ask a question that way. But if you want to ask a question tonight, then please log into YouTube and use the live chat box. At any point, you can put questions in as the talk progresses. To log into YouTube, it's not a special account or anything. You might have a YouTube account, but any Google account will work, such as Gmail. So over to Ruth for the revelations of Who Do You Think You Are?
Thank you very much. And it's hard to believe that it was just over a year ago that we were all in the hall together. Little did we realise, although I have to confess, while I wish we were in the hall together, after the talk that I gave last January, I rushed to the train station to discover that my train was cancelled and I had to wait an hour for a next train. I don't miss things like that. I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. So if you bear with me, there's always a slight pause here, isn't there? Is that working, Neil? Can you confirm?
Get that added. Yep, that's us.
Great. So as Neil said, I've put my email address on the first slide and the last slide. So if any questions pop into your head after the talk, I know what it's like. You're there, you're listening to the talk, you think of nothing at the time, and then it's when you get home or the next day or two that you suddenly have a question. Please feel free to drop me a line. I will happily answer the questions if I can. I'm here tonight to tell you about my time as a researcher on the very popular Who Do You Think You Are programme. If we were in person, I would be asking you to put up your hand to admit if you had never seen the TV show. It's quite hard nowadays to find people who haven't seen the show. It's been running for a number of years now. But I want to tell you about what it's like working behind the scenes. It's very popular. Family history is very popular. Indeed, everyone is doing their family tree nowadays. I laughed so much when I found this family tree. Donald Duck. Everyone is doing their family tree. And there's a couple of other cartoons I just want to show you that I think summarize what it's like to do family tree research. Some of you may be able to identify with this. You found who in your family tree? And also, he's been impossible ever since his internet search showed me he was 163rd in line to the throne. I think we all want to believe that we're descended from royalty or have connections. Since 2004, the television production company Wall to Wall has been producing Who Do You Think You Are for the BBC. One of the criticisms of the TV show is that it makes family history research look incredibly easy. In fact, after the first series had broadcast, membership of the London Library shot up by hundreds of percent, people wanting to go in, get a ticket to go and do their research. But the majority of them went in for one day, realised how hard the research actually was, and never went back again. I worked on programmes in series 2 to 7. There have been 17 series broadcast so far. And I just want to give you a little idea of the work that goes behind the scenes. Just as with family history of your own, when we start researching the stories, we literally have no idea what we might unearth. In fact, it's finding a crucial document that makes this job so brilliant. To give you some idea of timing, the series are roughly about 10 programs long. That takes a year to make at least. So it's a real sense of achievement when you see your program being aired. But the first starting point really is finding the celeb. Many a celeb can be used. By and large, Wall to Wall approach agents and ask if they want to be part of the TV series. Everyone has to be passed by the BBC, i.e., they need to be known by a BBC audience. Sometimes it's a case of reassuring the celebrity what the experience might be like, particularly for actors. Actors are often the ones most anxious about doing this because they're so used to being someone else on screen. But in this program, they are completely themselves. We also need to make sure that the celebrity has the time to do the filming. Once all the research has been done, we need a 10-day to 2-week period non-stop with a celebrity to do the filming. So we need to make sure they're available when we need them. We then have a chat with the celebrity, find out what they already know. Some people know quite a lot. Find out if there's anything specific they want to know or not to know. For some celebrities, they want to concentrate on one particular branch of the family, not look at the other branch at all. And some celebrities do say no. As I said, for actors in particular, it's quite daunting going on for an hour being yourself. And also, some people are just not wanting to expose their family to this kind of TV program. But as the series have gone on since 2004, it's easier and easier to get people to say yes. It's now become a well-known TV program, so they know what they're signing up for. By this point, after 17 series, chances are they have friends who've been on the program as well. Some say no initially, timing not right, a death in the family, for example, but they say yes the second time round. So once we have the celebrity, the next step is, of course, the research. Before we commit to making an episode with a particular celebrity, we do around 3 months of dedicated research. As with when you do your family history, it often leads to dead ends and brick walls. Sometimes we're incredibly lucky that vital clue will simply fall into our hands. But in some cases, we have to make the difficult decision to stop the research and let the celebrity know that we won't be able to make the program. At the end of the day, this is a television program. And while you might find it fascinating that a celebrity or your own family history contains generation after generation after generation of sheep farmers as a television program, it's less interesting. You may remember, of course, a few years ago, Michael Parkinson was perhaps the most famous celebrity who we did the research. Just wasn't enough to make an interesting television program. If we say no to the TV program, we do provide the celebrity with all the research that we've done so that they can carry on if they want, or at least find out for themselves what's in their family tree. So for a run of about 10 episodes, we research around 30 people initially. The other thing that needs to be considered is that within those 10 episodes, to have a breadth of stories. It would be incredibly boring to have 10 episodes in a series where all we talked about was the First World War, One of the successes of Who Do You Think You Are? It is that it shows different areas of the country and it shows different time periods as well. So while we're doing the research, all of that needs to be balanced as well. We then start to build the family tree. Just as with your own family history, we look at the birth, marriage, and death certificates. And this is where I am incredibly grateful that I do family history research in Scotland, because the certificates up here give you a lot more information than they do in England. Birth certificates, for example. Birth certificates tell you not only the normal information, but they also tell you in Scotland the date and place of the marriage of the parents. They don't in England. Marriage certificates in England, you get the name of the father of both the bride and the groom. In Scotland, you don't just get the father of both the bride and the groom, but you also get the mother of the bride and the groom as well. All this extra information. And on death certificates in Scotland, you generally also get the information on the parents of the deceased. All of this helps make it much easier and quicker to investigate family trees. Another reason it's much easier to do research up here in Scotland is that the Scottish Government realised very early on that family tree, family history was a big money making business. There's a big tourism industry, or at least pre-COVID there was, of people coming to Scotland to research their ancestry. In Scotland, birth, marriage, and death certificates all being digitised. So you can go to Edinburgh, go down to the Scotland's People Centre, excuse me, pay your money, sit in your seat for the day, and do research. You see the certificates up on the screen. You can print a copy if you want, but you get all that information. And because you've got those extra bits of information, you can progress really quickly. In England, the certificates haven't been digitised. The index to the certificates have. So what you can do through Find My Past or Ancestry, for example, is look at the indexes. You might find an entry that you think is yours. So you'll find the date done by quarter. So January to March is quarter one. So you find the quarter and the year. You have the name. And then you have the place of registration. Armed with that information, you get a little code. You sign up, pay, I think it's about £9 now to get a certificate. It's posted out to you, takes about a week. And then you open up the envelope, take out the certificate, keep your fingers crossed, and hopefully it is your ancestor that you are holding the certificate about. There are forums on on various websites nowadays, though, of people who have lots of certificates, who've ordered them, but they've turned out to be nothing to do with their family. For example, my family, one of the branches in my tree, they're called Tiny, Tiney. Based down in London, quite a few down in London, but also the indexes, well, sometimes they can be typed up wrongly. A fancy T in the 19th century can sometimes look like an F. So I have had to order certificates in both Tiny and Finey in the hope that I will find my ancestors. Now on the screen, I've shown a particular birth certificate, partly to highlight the amount of information that you can see. So for example, if you look at the second entry, you can see in the third big column the name of the parent, and underneath 15th of October, Dunfermline. That's where they were married. Brilliant information. But it was the one at the top, Mary Lamont, illegitimate, that I was particularly interested in. She was the one that fitted into a celebrity's family tree. And what excited me here, and this is very unusual, I haven't seen this happen before, is that not only do we have information about her parents, no marriage details, they're not married at the moment. So you have Henry Lamont is the father, he's a brick moulder, and Jessie Isaponi, she is a power loom weaver. This is in Dunfermline, so not too far away from you guys. But they've also put in, for some reason, and I don't know why, information about Jessie. So in the red girl that I've done. You can see Jessie Isaponi, power loom weaver, and then in brackets, daughter of Italian modeler in terracotta work. So not only have I found Mary Lamont's birth certificates, but I've been given details about her parents and her maternal grandfather, which is an incredible amount of information. So we look at all the birth, marriage, and death certificates that we can. We also go into parish records. Of course, statutory registration only came in 1855 in Scotland, 1837 in England. So anything earlier than that, we need to go to parish records, which can prove a little bit trickier. And we also look at census records. Census records can be a wealth of information, but there are, of course, a number of things you have to bear in mind. Not least, if your ancestor couldn't read or write, someone would come round and fill out the information for them. Sometimes they wouldn't always tell the truth. How old are you? You going to tell the truth or are you going to lie? You might round it down a little bit. I'm showing here a census from 1911 down in England. Unfortunately, the census household records in Scotland have been destroyed a few years ago, so we don't have this incredible record like this. But census records can tell you not just about your ancestors, but give you a real snapshot of the social conditions that they were living in. The census of 1911 was a big boycott campaign by the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, and other suffragettes who wanted to boycott the census. And as you can see here, someone has written, "No vote, no census." Essentially, they're saying, if you think I cannot put an X in a ballot paper, then surely I couldn't possibly fill in this schedule. There are incredible bits of information that you can gather from census records. And all of this really helps us when we're looking at a celebrity's family tree. Are there interesting information? Who are they living nearby? What kind of conditions are they living in? Who are they living with? Lodges sometimes can be really interesting, not realizing the different connections that are being made. So we do all of this research. It really helps to build up the stories. And then once we've decided after all this research, we're definitely going to go ahead with the celebrity. The producers and directors will look at the different stories and pick on the ones to concentrate on. Once they've decided the stories to concentrate on, again bearing in mind an arc of 10 episodes, wanting a bit of variety, we have the family tree. I have to say, a little aside, at the very beginning, there was a kind of a spin-off series to Who Do You Think You Are? That was on BBC Four. And it was a similar idea, family history, but it was for ordinary people rather than a celebrity. And I was asked to get involved in one of the programs. A gentleman who'd been born illegitimate, given up for adoption in London, he wanted to find out about his birth mother's family. And that's where I came in, because his birth mother came from the very north of Scotland, up in the Highlands, about as far as you could get. So I started doing a bit of research and I discovered that he was born in kind of late 1950s, early 1960s, I think. So I did some research. She was one of 14 children. So already you've got quite a big family tree. Both her parents, also one of about 14 each. So you can imagine 14 children and 14 uncles and aunts on either side. And then her grandparents were also one of at least 10 on either side. The family tree was so wide, we had to produce it on a massive bit of paper. And when I went to see him for the filming to show him the family tree, it was too big for the table. So we actually had to push all the furniture out the way and lay it on the floor so that I could roll it out and he could have a little look. So we have the family tree, we decide which stories to look at. We start to look for extra information that can back up the stories. This, for example, is a medal record from the First World War of possibly my great-grandfather, not entirely sure. His name was Bertie Howes, but I haven't been able to confirm if this is the right one or not. There's a lot of that when you're doing family trees, finding information about ancestors and trying to confirm if it is actually your ancestor or not. You look for photographs as well. Television is a very visual medium, so you need photographs to illustrate things that have happened, photographs of people. So this little boy on the bottom left, that's my nephew. He's now 8 years old. Photograph in the middle, you may recognise. It is me, dressed up as Duchess Anne Hamilton at an event many years ago now, pre-COVID, when you could dress up and do events in person. You find photographs of famous people who were around at the same time as your ancestor, the Duke of Wellington, or places they may have visited, the Forth Bridge. You build all of this up to try and make as visual a story as possible and to get as much of the story out as possible as well. There can be frustrations along the way. For example, a friend of mine, he was doing research on the Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen program. And while he was doing the research, wall to wall believed that there was a chance that the farm his ancestor owned was mentioned in the manorial roll. Now, this is a very, very old roll. The manor, the lord of the manor, writing down everything that he owns and everything that he has given away and who works on his land and the like. They're very, very big. Some of them are massive, rolled up, about that big. And you have to unroll them. Very hard to read at times, but they were convinced that there would be a reference to this farm on one of these rolls. It became the focus of attention to the point where they had someone in on work experience at the time and they trained him up to go and help my friend look. They looked through a total of 300 rolls. It took over a week, dedicated looking at nothing else, Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, doing nothing but looking at these rolls. And there was no mention whatsoever. So there's a huge amount of research that produces nothing. And of course, that doesn't appear in the film at all. So as a researcher, it can be a little bit frustrating at times. Once you've got all the stories together, then you can lay the trail for filming. The thing to realize is that when the celebrities are being filmed, they don't know what they're about to be told. They don't know where they're going. They don't know what the story is. They know nothing until the camera is rolling. So any emotion you see on screen, that's a genuine emotion. I remember watching Chris Moyles, Radio 1 DJ, and his family was from Ireland, and for several days when they were filming, he was hearing about nothing but death. Families having babies and not many of them surviving. Famine, poverty, death. It was relentless, and over several days you could see the impact it was having on him. We make the story. It takes between 10 days and 2 weeks to film. If they are going away anywhere, they don't get told where, or the bare minimum. They might be told what to pack, but again, the bare minimum. And then once the filming is finished, there's the editing process, the cutting down, sometimes cutting stories out completely, adding the music, the voiceovers, archive footage, and the like. But perhaps the most difficult experience I've heard of during a filming of a program, not one I was involved in, but one I heard about, was this gentleman, Alan Cumming, incredible actor. And it was a very unusual program in that the whole program was only focused on one of his ancestors, his maternal grandfather. Now, the family knew that his maternal grandfather had died accidentally from a gunshot while he was out in Malaysia, but they didn't know the full extent of the story. Our research showed that actually his maternal grandfather, who was working and living in Malaysia, had played Russian roulette. And it was during Russian roulette that he shot himself and died. Now, that's quite a hard story to tell someone. And I know that my colleagues did debate about whether to go ahead with the filming or not. But they decided to, and Alan and his family were very grateful that they did. They went out to Malaysia. Alan's maternal grandfather had served there during the Second World War. Like many, struggled to get back into civilian life afterwards. So decided to head back to Malaysia to seek the thrill of being a motorcyclist policeman. And seeking even more thrill, turned one night to playing Russian roulette. He's held in great esteem in Malaysia. There's a park and a couple of streets named after him, and Alan and his mum were able to go and visit them. There was an enormous sense of responsibility towards Alan and his mum, but they wanted to know the truth, so they were glad that they went ahead with it. His maternal grandfather had been 35 years old when he died in 1949, and Alan and his mum, the daughter of this man who'd killed himself, were able to find out the truth. But for me, one of the most heartbreaking stories of that, not just the fact that he died from Russian roulette, we discovered that his personal effects after he died had been put on a ship, sailed back to Britain, got as far as Liverpool. But Alan's grandmother was so poor she couldn't afford to get his effects sent from Liverpool to Dundee, where they were living. And they were there for about a year until colleagues of Alan's grandfather heard about it, raised some money, and were able to send them up. It was an incredible program. I don't know how many of you watched it, but it also shows how you don't know what you're going to discover when you do the research. We knew from Alan, of course, that his grandfather had died from a shooting accident. We didn't know the truth about it. Alan wrote a book, the name of which escapes me for the moment, an autobiography. And it was set during this time that he was filming Who Do You Think You Are? And at this time, unbeknownst to people who were doing the filming, Alan's father was coming out and saying some really quite horrible things about him in the press. So Alan was dealing with all of that while also discovering what had happened to his maternal grandfather. The book is well worth a read. I would thoroughly recommend it. But what a guy Alan is. Once we've done all the filming, we do warn the celebrity not to talk to their family. We don't want any leaks getting out if possible. Sometimes names do get leaked to the press before the press release is issued. If you see a celebrity in the archives doing research, there's a good chance that they're there for Who Do You Think You Are? But sometimes false leaks are made as well, just to get people guessing and trying to work out who is going to be on the programme. At the end, we give the celebrity a big research folder with all of the documents used in the filming, and they get a copy of the genealogy report, which has a lot of the unfilmed stuff as well. I just want to talk about some of the preferences or quirks which have to be accommodated when filming. Jeremy Irons, top left, he was accompanied throughout the entire filming process by his two dogs, two of the most obedient dogs anyone had ever seen. But transport and accommodation had to be found for the dogs wherever they went, which proved tricky. They needed to be fed and watered, just like the humans, and they needed to be kept happy as well. And there was one occasion where one of the dogs managed to jump into the big pond that's outside the National Archives in Kew in between two takes. They didn't realise at the time, and it was only when they came to editing that it caused continuity problems. There are, of course, unusual health and safety concerns as well. A risk assessment form had to be filled in for the leeches that Natasha Kaplinsky on the right was so disgusted to find her ancestor would have used when he was a member of the Royal Society of Apothecaries. And Alastair Mcgowan was happily walking through an Indian graveyard before someone pointed out that snakes also liked being in that graveyard. And very quickly, a pair of Wellington boots had to be bought for him to ensure that no snake bites from particularly venomous snakes were encountered. I'm just going to talk about some of the programs that I worked on. And sticking with Alastair Mcgowan, when Waterwall talked to Alastair Mcgowan at the beginning to see how much he knew, he told them how proud he was of his Scottish ancestry and he would love to find out at what point the family became Scottish. He knew he was Scottish, he had a real sense of pride. He also had a sense of conflict whenever England were playing Scotland, football or rugby. Who should he support? He should really support England because he was English, but I really wanted to support Scotland as well because he also felt Scottish. So while my colleagues were doing research in England and India, there's a big part of his story from India, of course, I was set the task to try and find this Scottish ancestor. I spent weeks and weeks going through as many documents as possible. They'd got as far back as I could in England, so I was trying to get as far back as I could in Scotland, trying to find some link. I couldn't find it at all. For anyone who watched it, right at the very end of the document, for the programme rather, Alastair Mcgowan was given a document. He thinks this is where my Scottish ancestry comes from. He wasn't Scottish at all. McGowan was an Irish name. There wasn't a single link to Scotland that we could find at all. Again, showing that you could spend a long time researching behind the scenes for research that never makes it into a programme. I used to work front of house at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh a few years ago, and Alastair McGowan once performed there as part of his Gilbert and Sullivan performance. And I was able to get backstage and speak to him. And he was still annoyed that he wasn't Scottish. He remembered fondly the whole experience of Who Do You Think You Are? He was very grateful to everyone for the research, but he still secretly really wished that he was Scottish. Another celebrity that I worked on, the brilliant Monty Dunn. I have to say that most of the time I never get to meet the celebrities. I would love to have met Monty Dunn. I think he's incredible. But we discovered that his family were from Dundee. At the beginning, when I was first involved in Who Do You Think You Are, I was involved at the very beginning doing the research. As years went on, more and more documents were available online. All of the birth, marriage, and death certificates, for example, in Census Records. So it then became I only got involved when there was a particular research aspect that I needed to help with. And for Monty Dunn, they'd done all the family tree, they knew the stories they wanted to concentrate on. And one of them was in Dundee. Monty Dunn is descended from the Keeler family, the Marmalade family of Dundee. And they wanted me to do some research in the Keeler family archive. At the time, one of his ancestors was based down on Guernsey. He was the younger brother of the Keeler family. And the older brother, Monty Dunn's uncle, great uncle, was in Dundee. The older brother was the one running the business, but Guernsey is where they had all the sugar shipped in. Ship it into Guernsey, don't have to pay as much tax as if it went directly to Dundee. This is in the 19th century. So the brothers communicated to each other by letter. And the copies of the letters are still in the Dundee City archives, written on kind of almost onion-like paper, some of the ink running through and quite hard to read at times. But also, I found quite hilarious because the two brothers hated each other. And as you can imagine, Guernsey and Dundee, quite far away, letters take a while to reach each other. And quite often, letters were crossing each other. So a brother would respond to a letter he had just received, even though actually there was another letter that was on its way as well. So they were responding to things out of time, out of context, and really not liking each other at all. It was great fun to do the research, and that was part of the story that fitted into the programme, which was brilliant. But there was another aspect to the Monty Dunn story that I did research that unfortunately didn't make it into the programme at all. We discovered that his forgotten how many times great-grandfather and ancestors were involved in the siege of Stirling Castle when James VI was a tiny wee boy and regents were looking after him. Not that long, really, after Mary Queen of Scots had abdicated. So they did filming around this. We did research. I went to the archives in Edinburgh and I did research there. And we set up trails and we found documents. And Monty Dunn came and did some filming. He looked at the documents in Edinburgh. He did filming in Stirling. He was told all about the battle and this battle for the soul of the young boy king. It was a brilliant story. And also at that point, not many of the programs had gone back as far as the 16th century. It was incredible. Unfortunately, until I watched the program, I didn't realize that they'd had to edit that entire section of the story out because they just didn't have time for it in the program. So again, it shows that even when you've done all the research and the filming has happened, it doesn't mean that you are going to end up in the final program either. Another program I worked on, Fiona Bruce. Her family, her 3 times great-grandfather, came from Hopeman up in Moray, quite near Elgin. And I got to go. See, not only have I been to Dundee, but I got to go up to Elgin to do some research. The family lived up there for several generations, they were fishermen up there. But by the time her 3 times great-grandfather George died in 1876, it was a really hard existence. There wasn't much fish around. During the summer, they could get enough money to keep going, but winter was particularly hard. Elgin Archives, if you've ever been up there, have a fantastic photographic resource and showing the villages around there, showing the fishermen, the fisher wives, the families eking out, but also showing the poverty. And George Bruce died in 1876. He died of malnutrition and he was described as a drunken creature. His son either wouldn't or couldn't support him, so he was left to poor relief. Someone who didn't die of poor relief or malnutrition, and someone who does also feature sheep farming is David Mitchell. This was a really interesting program to work on and quite Scottish. I think virtually the whole program was set in Scotland. A few aspects to it. He discovered that some of his ancestors were sheep farmers up in Tongue, up in the Highlands. David already knew this, but he was really worried that his family got hold of the farm through Highland clearances. He was worried that his family had helped kick off some of the poor tenants to set up a sheep farm. And we were able, through our research, to reassure him that this had not happened. The land had been cleared well before his family came and took over in the 19th century. There's lots of research that we did up there, and he did some interesting filming up there, but it was on Sky that the story for me really got interesting. His great-grandfather wrote Gaelic reference books, and his great-great-grandfather also wrote Gaelic books as well. His 2 times great-grandfather also helped the parishioners up in Skye during the famine. He campaigned to help young women who were lured south on false promises of well-paid jobs. He was a minister. He looked after his flock, and yet when he died, in his will, it said that his wife should receive nothing. She was completely cut out of the will, stating that she was utterly unworthy of trust or confidence, being unfortunately addicted during a period of 18 years to the vice of intemperance. In other words, she was a drunk and he didn't want her to get any money. And he also, in his will, forbade his sons or daughters to help her out either. Wills are really interesting. If you can find them, they can tell you so much, not just about your close-knit family, but about anyone and everyone that your ancestor has decided to leave money to. A colleague of mine on a totally different project once found a will from, I think, the 16th century, and in it, the father writing the will said that he would leave all of his fortune to his 2 sons, provided within a year of his death, both sons left England and moved abroad forever. For England was going to rack and ruin, and he didn't want his sons to stay there. If they decided to ignore his advice and stay in England, then they were to receive a penny each, and the rest of his money was to go elsewhere. There are 2 programs I'm particularly proud of, and this is one of them. Matthew Pinsent, Olympic rower, a giant of a man, an incredible guy, and this is the only program that I actually appeared in. In some ways, doing research for Matthew Pinsent's family tree was really easy. If you're doing research, you want your family to be either rather poor or rich. That way there tend to be records left about them. If you're in the middle, not so many records. Matthew's family tree showed a lot of rich people, so it was very easy to do the research. He is descended on one branch from William Jardine, who was a naturalist. He was also connected with the Jardine family, who went out to China and set up the Jardine Matheson Company, who were very involved in the opium trade. And when I did filming with Matthew, it was the day after he'd returned from his trip to China. As I say, he had no idea where he was going at the time. He had no idea what he would discover when he got to China. He was a bit jet lagged, a bit shell shocked, really, from discovering what he'd found out about his ancestors. in China, and I was meeting him at 8 o'clock in the morning. I had been taken down the night before by train, stayed in London, all expenses, stayed in the very luxurious Premier Inn. Oh, yes, nothing but the best when you're a researcher. Then the next morning, got picked up very early and taken to this place that you can see in the photograph. This was a restaurant that opened up early for us to do some filming in. I greeted Matthew. There was only one cameraman. And so we greeted each other 5 times so he could get different angles. So you could work out when the editing, which one worked. So the first time was very enthusiastic. Hi, lovely to meet you. By the 5th time, slightly less enthusiastic. Hello, how do you do? We sat at that table. I showed him the family tree. I explained his connections to William Jardine, the naturalist, who operated around about the same time as Charles Darwin and was a very big name at the time. I showed him a family tree, rolled it back a few times, showed him how rich his family tree were, and also the fact that they had titles. If you have a title, there are definitely records that you can go and have a look at. So I sent Matthew on his way, and he went round the corner. I walked with him actually, although that is not shown in the program. In the program, he got in a taxi to there. He didn't at all. We walked around the corner, went to the Court of Lions equivalent, and in he went. This was the first time, this series that the program was in, was the first time that Who Do You Think You Are was being shown on BBC One. Before that, it had been on BBC Two. I went down south to my family when it was broadcast, so I could sit there with my parents and my sister, very excited. Here I was about to be on prime time BBC TV. I was so excited. And I appeared. You could see me greeting Matthew. You could see me talking to him. You saw quite a lot of my finger pointing. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Very exciting. My sister is not so interested in history. And the first thing she said to me as I appeared on TV was, you're wearing the same clothes. That's how excited she was that I was on TV. Anyway, back to the day of filming. Matthew, as I said, had gone to the Court of Lions equivalent. So he was being taken in, shown all the titles that his ancestors had had. And he was descended from one of the wives of Henry VIII, and through her back as far as Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Very exciting. But if you were a king in the medieval period, the Middle Ages, you truly believed that you were descended from God. So in front of Matthew's eyes, the gentleman who was talking to him at the time showed him a family tree from the medieval time. There was his ancestor, Edward I. He rolled it back, William the Conqueror. Rolled it back, Canute was there. Rolled it back, Adam and Eve. Rolled it back to the very top, God. So we were able to show Matthew Pinsent he was descended from God. And this hand shook the hand of a descendant of God. Now, in normal times, pre-COVID, I charge people if they want to shake my hand. That is absolutely fine. Post-COVID, I will do the same as well. As soon as the program aired, my private research clients at the time, quite a few of them were emailing me and going, do you think we're descended from God as well? This, however, was the very first program I got involved in. Series 2, Jeremy Paxman. And this was the program that I probably did the most research for. As I say, at the very beginning, there was less documentation available online back in 2005. The internet was not what it is now. So I did an incredible amount of information about of research. I was able to do all the family tree and then find the documentation. I even got involved in a wee trip that the assistant director and producer did when they were trying to find locations that they could do filming in. I wasn't involved in the filming, but I did a lot of research beforehand. We discovered, or rather I discovered, that Jeremy's great-grandfather died in Rutherglen, the south of Glasgow. He'd been a school janitor at the time of his death, and the school he'd been working at shut for half a day so the children could attend the funeral. That shows you how much he was held in esteem. But unfortunately, because he'd died, the rest of the family, their source of income was lost. We're talking the kind of towards the end of the 19th century here. He left behind a wife and several children, all under the age of 10. And she really struggled. They had to move to Bridgerton, which is a really, even today, it's quite near the Gorbals. It's quite a rundown area. They went on poor relief, so they got given money by the state to help them. However, over the next couple of years or so, the great-grandmother had 2 illegitimate children, and someone wrote to the authorities to let them know. And the authorities let her know that she could either go into the workhouse, which meant that she would essentially not see her children because the children and adults were split up, or she could cope on her own. And she decided her children were too precious to her. She decided to stick it out on the outside. They were living in a single ender, so 1 room, a massive family. But around this time, the Salvation Army was starting up in Glasgow, and they really helped, to the point where Jeremy's mother became part of the Salvation Army, and that's how his parents met. There's a great amount of poverty in the story. Interestingly for me, I'm originally from Suffolk. Jeremy Paxman also had a Suffolk family story as well. Again, a lot of poverty, having to do poor relief. These stories combined, there was a lot of poverty in his family, which just goes to show you can't judge someone on what their family tree might be like. I happened to be in London when they were up in Glasgow filming, and I still remember the phone call I got from the assistant director telling me that Jeremy Paxman, this man who has brought politicians to their knees whenever he's interviewed them, had cried on television. Nowadays, it doesn't sound that big a deal, but this was the first Who Do You Think You Are programme where a celebrity had died, and it had been Jeremy Paxman, the very last person we would have thought would have cried. It was an incredible experience. I have to say I'm quite proud knowing that it was my research that made him cry. As I say, I didn't get to meet him when he was filming. I haven't met him at all, really, but he did send me a letter. He sent me a letter. There's his signature. I'm just going to read it out to you. Dear Ruth, I'm imagining that they will be editing Who Do You Think You Are for weeks, so I thought I would drop you a line now. I just wanted to say a brief thank you for your help. I've never had much interest in my ancestors, but the experience of trying to discover what became of them turned out to be unexpectedly touching. It would not have been so without your help. The census records and the like were one thing, but the school records and the Hardy-esque tale of my maternal great-grandmother were remarkable. Thank you. I hope our paths cross again sometime. Now, that might just be a throwaway sentence, but I know it's not, because not only did Jeremy write me a letter, he put his home address on it. So I know that if things get really, really hard, I can just rock up at his house, knock on the door, and I'm sure he will more than willingly let me come in and have a cup of tea. Who Do You Think You Are, once it had started, became a huge success in the UK, and the rights to it were sold by wall to wall to TV companies throughout the world. Nowadays, you can find wall to wall in Canada. Who Do You Think You Are, rather, in Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Israel, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Romania, Portugal, Russia, South Africa, Sweden, the USA, and Australia. And certainly at the beginning, I don't know if it happens now, certainly at the beginning, when wall to wall sold the rights to a TV company in a different country, they would also give them a list of researchers that they had used, which is how I came to work on this program. This is an Australian program, an amazing woman called Magda Schebansky. She was in Babe, the film. She was in the Australian sitcom Kath and Kim. She's a big name out in Australia. Her ancestor, well, you've already seen the name of some of them. The birth certificate I showed you of Mary Lamont, illegitimate, with Jessie Isaponi, the mother, and also the daughter of the Italian sculptor. That is part of Magda's family. Her mother was from Scotland. Her father had come from Poland. So there was filming done in Scotland and Poland and also Ireland, where some of her family had come from as well. Because this was the first time the Australian company had done any filming for Who Do You Think You Are outside of Australia, I got a bit more involved. So I met Magda a few times. She was staying at the Balmoral, of course. Where else would you stay? Here in Edinburgh. We did some filming across in Fife. Her uncle still lived in Kirkcaldy at the time. And so we set it up, and the TV company really wanted to film going across the Forth Bridge, this iconic railway bridge that's famous world over. So it took me a few days, a few weeks to set up all the permissions, to film at the train station, to film on the train. All of that was set up. It was December, we were sat on the train, and to be honest, we couldn't see a thing at all. It was one of those days where the mist descends, and even though I knew we were on the bridge, we couldn't see we were on the bridge at all. Her uncle was so excited about seeing her, even though he was hard up himself. He had saved up his money so that he could employ a bagpipe player to be there to welcome her when she arrived. It's very touching. And that night, Magda invited me to have dinner with her. And I thought it was just a kind gesture, and it was in many ways. However, she quizzed me quite a lot over dinner. Or she would say things like, "Oh, I wonder if we're going to discover next," say what she thought, and then try and see if she could work out from my facial expression whether she was on the right track or not. As I say, we don't tell the celebrities anything beforehand. I've had an incredible amount of fun doing the research on Wall to Wall, but with the television, if you're not available one time, they quickly find someone else and move on. So unfortunately, I've not been involved in a few years' time. But research is really good fun. Family history research in particular. Although I should warn you, it can get very addictive. Thank you very much indeed. As I say, my email address is there if you have questions afterwards, but I'm also happy to take questions now if there are any.
Thank you very much for that, Ruth. Yeah, it's so good to hear, to hear behind the scenes, because it's not something that you encounter very often. And yeah, I suppose some of the things that emerge must be an equal measure, quite heart-lifting, but also can be quite sad as well, I imagine. One question I had was, is there anything that you uncovered that you, or indeed a guest, wish hadn't been uncovered? I mean, maybe you can't say for confidentiality reasons, but anything?
There's one celebrity that we did do research for, that we started researching anyway, that we were really hoping to make a program, a Scottish celebrity that I think would have been really interesting. A celebrity who sadly died a few years ago, so there's no possibility of us coming back to revisit this. But he had said at the very beginning that if his mother's mother turned out to be illegitimate, then he wouldn't do any filming at all, because his mother was still alive and was of an age where illegitimacy had still quite a lot of stigma about it. And almost the first thing we discovered was that his mother's mother was illegitimate. So within a few days already we had to stop. So we were quite gutted that we found that, because it meant that completely stopped any aspect or possibility of doing filming. And as I say, I think this particular ancestor, particular celebrity would have been, would have been a really interesting program.
And was there anything that you've uncovered that perhaps hasn't made it to the screen, whether it's related to a celebrity or not indeed?
There's always aspects of the research that don't make it to the screen. As I mentioned with Monty Dunn, the whole kind of 16th century story of the battle at the siege of Stirling Castle didn't make it to the programme, although it was filmed. It's difficult because 60 minutes sounds a lot, but actually it's not when you start to delve into some of the stories. And there's always, as a researcher, you get quite particular about your own research, and you really want your bit to get in, but you're only one part of a big team who are doing research. So yeah, you have to. The most frustrating thing I have to say as a researcher is not seeing your name in the credits. That didn't happen with Wall to Wall. I was incredibly lucky. All the Who Do You Think You Are programs that I was involved in, my name appeared. But there was a Channel 4 series I'd been involved in, hosted by Ian Hislop, which was looking at First World War memorials and the stories behind the families on there. I found some heartbreaking stories in that. And I did a lot of research for it as well, but none of the researchers, apart from the lead researcher, had their name in the credits. And that can be quite gutting, because We love doing research, but we also love showing off that we did the research. And there's nothing nicer, I have to say. And this it is egotistical, but there's nothing nicer than seeing your name appear in the credits and going, "Yes, I did the research, and there's my proof. My name is up there."
I'm actually a wee bit surprised to hear you say that, because certainly it strikes me with watching movies that when the credits roll at the end, there seems to be absolutely everybody, people, roles that I've never encountered before.
Movies have a lot longer to do credits. TV programs tend to have a lot shorter time to do credits. This was a few years ago, so maybe it's got better, but I certainly know people who've worked in the industry, TV industry anyway, who've had their name left off credits. Maybe I need to move into the movies. Maybe that's what I need to do.
Maybe that's it. Yeah. So there's a question in chat here. Remember, folks, that you could type your message into chat just now. So the question is: do any of the celebrities decide they don't want to broadcast the findings of the research after they find out what has been discovered?
They're not that I'm aware of. I think they sign an agreement that once it's been filmed, that's kind of it. They can say beforehand if there are particular aspects they don't want to be filmed. So one celebrity had been abandoned by their father when they were younger, so they wanted nothing to do with that branch. So we just stayed away from that. There are other celebrities who may have said that, particular aspects of stories they don't want to look at, or certain ancestors they don't want to look at. So we take that into account when we do the research. Like the celebrity who said that, mother's mother illegitimate, no go. They get the chance at the beginning to say things like that. But to be honest, once they're filming, they're pretty much happy with it because they get so caught up in it as well. So as far as I'm aware, everybody we've filmed, we've broadcast.
Yeah, I suppose I could see it could become contractual, because obviously there's quite a bit of financial commitment involved, from the
By the
production.
time we come to filming, there's been a lot of work involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another question here. Is there anyone that you'd have liked the opportunity to research?
Oh, good question.
That's...
See, the trouble is, by answering that, I'm giving you some idea of which celebrities I really like. I mean, James McAvoy would be really interesting to do because I really like him. See, I would only want to research celebrities that I have a chance of meeting. So James McAvoy definitely would be up there. Who else? Oh, you've put me on the spot now. Good question.
It wouldn't have to be a celebrity necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I hope to have shown slightly in this talk, and that anyone who does family history realizes, is that you just have no idea where you're going to go with the research. So it doesn't really, in some ways, it doesn't matter who the start point is. You just have no idea what direction you're going to go in. In my own family tree, for example, there is a rumor, I'm desperately trying to confirm this, that there was a highwayman in my family tree. And I think that would be really exciting. I like that, a dashing highwayman. What I'm really hoping is that I discover a map with an X marks a spot. I can go and discover his treasure somehow.
Oh, of course, yeah. Even a highwayman, never mind the treasure, that would still be quite something, wouldn't it?
It was interesting. For a really long time in Australia, people didn't want to admit that they had convicts in their family. There was a real stigma against it. Certainly in the early 20th century, up until kind of 1970s, 1980s, whereas nowadays everyone wants to be descended from a convict who is wrongly sent out to Australia. How very dare they? So it's interesting, just even the trends within family history change over time as well.
Yes, I suppose I could understand that. I mean, it's certainly fairly common knowledge, isn't it, that a lot of Australians, that was their background. I suppose it's when you get into the injustice or the apparent injustice, that's where it puts a slightly different slant on it.
Exactly. And you want a convict who was unjustly sentenced and sent out. You don't really want one who was, thinking about some of the murders and some of the crimes that were committed. You don't necessarily want some of that in your background.
No, but equally, if you were deported for stealing a loaf of bread, quite a different matter. So technically
Exactly.
they're convicts, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's hardly well, clearly not a hanging offence.
We're human beings at the end of the day, and what we're drawn to is stories, and that's what family history allows us to discover is all these stories, not just the stories about our ancestors, but about the times that they lived in. So even an ancestor who's convicted of stealing a loaf of bread and sentenced to 7 years transportation, that's a fascinating story in itself, because that
Yeah,
tells you so
yeah.
much about the morals of the time and the values of the time.
Well, exactly. That was the exact kind of comment I was going to make, because it just seems incredible that such a thing could have been done for such a small, and probably the person was starving. It wasn't just stealing for the sake of
Hmm.
making money. It's probably, through necessity than anything else.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Um, so a couple of other questions have come in, Ruth.
Hmm.
Who's been your favourite celebrity to research in terms of the most exciting discoveries?
I think Matthew Pinsent was, simply because his family were so rich, we were able to go back so far. We got us back as far as Bannockburn, and we could find members of his family on both sides of Bannockburn, and that was really quite exciting, because when you do family history, it's really hard to get past the 19th century, because the records often don't exist, or they're really hard to find. To be able to research someone as far as the 14th century was really exciting from a kind of really geeky history point of view. Going, oh my God, this is amazing. Several hundred years back.
Mm, mhm.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
And a kind of supplementary question, I suppose. Are you willing to tell us who has been the least interesting?
No. Simply because I have to say, I have found all of them interesting, because you don't know what you're going to discover. I always say, at the heart of me, I am a storyteller. And what I'm doing is enabling stories to be told. So even, saying David Mitchell sheep farmer, that for some people might be boring, but it was fascinating looking at the conditions of the 19th century, coping with the highlands that had only fairly recently gone through highland clearances, and all the change that had created on the land. There's always so much interesting stuff that you can find out that, to be honest, all of them that I've researched, I've enjoyed.
Yeah, and as you say, it's not about the person as such. That's their past and the events that have happened, maybe what their ancestors were,
Hmm.
have been. That's kind of add a dimension that, obviously, as you say, you've got no idea until you start to kind of go down that route. But presumably,
Exactly.
and amongst all this, um, the production company would soon sort of stop in the early part of the process, presumably. I think you kind of touched on that if it doesn't look like it's going to be particularly interesting or sort of
Hmm.
wide enough, then they'll kind of pull the plug on it.
If your family has come from one place and they haven't moved for 1,000 years, and all they've done is the same job, you can't really make a 60-minute TV program out of that. So there is that balance, absolutely. Um, the but that's also one of the kind of the interesting things, going, well, what are we going to find? Are we going to find stories? You kind of almost start off assuming you're not going to find anything, because you know how hard it is to find the stories. So it's
Mhm.
almost kind of a bonus when you find the stories, rather than the other way around.
Another question here. Have you been involved in research for any other TV programs? And if so, which has been your favourite?
Well, I did the War Memorial one that I mentioned. That was heartbreaking stories, but fascinating, and that came at a really interesting time in my life, when I was starting to uh, be trained as a tour guide to take high school students out to Belgium and France and teach them about the First World War. So it was a really interesting kind of juxtaposition between the two jobs that I was doing at the time. Any other? I did. In fact, my friend's son rang me up the other day and went, "I've just seen a program with you in it." Many, many years ago, I think 2005, 2006 time. It was a one-off program. It was called The Boy Who Lived Before, shown on Channel 5, produced by October Films. And it was a little boy who lived across in the west of Scotland. And he, ever since he could talk, he talked about this other family. He had memories of, for him, another life. And so the program was looking at whether reincarnation was a thing, whether memories, because there are a few children around the world who claim to have memories of another life. And I was brought in essentially to research this family that he claimed he'd been with, to see if they existed, to see if I could find any information. And while I still don't think I believe in having other lives, a lot of what he said was true, kind of spookily so. So, and that was really interesting. And I did the research and I got to meet the little boy, who at the time when I met him was about 6 or 7, I think. So he'd spent, a good 4 years talking about this other family. And there were things that he said that were definitely true. How he found that out, I have no idea. But yeah, that was a really interesting program. I've also done bits and pieces for radio as well. Radio is in some ways more interesting because there's less pressure for the visual aspect of it. So you can almost let the stories speak for themselves a bit more. But either, I love doing either. There's less opportunity for me to do it now, unfortunately, but I do enjoy it. Although there's always the pressure because the media always works to really tight deadlines and they want things done yesterday.
Yeah. Is there anything, another question actually, is there anything that you're working on now? I mean, apart from your own research, is there anything anything in the pipeline that?
Nothing media-wise, unfortunately. There's just my own research. So I'm doing a big project at the moment on or would be if the archive was open. As soon as it's open, I'm going to be the first one there, looking at the 1911 census in Scotland and how the suffragettes used it. And I'm hoping to finish the research and then turn it into a book, because that's an aspect that's not really been looked at. There's a book that's looking at the 1911 census in England and Wales and whether the suffragettes really boycotted down there or not. But no one's really looked up here in Scotland. So I've done some research already. I have a lot more to do. COVID, has put a spanner in the works for the time being. But yeah. So there's no media, but always my own research.
Hopefully not long now before you get back, and another couple of months, maybe something like that, and you'll be back.
It would be so good.
Into the archives and libraries and such like. Okay, what else do we have here? I'm not sure whether this is directly in relation to who do you think you are, or whether this is just a general question. Do you have to reference your research like you would in university work?
So for TV programs, within the credits, they say thank you to the people who own the documents. So they'll say thank you to the National Archives or the National Library and things like that. So that's the kind of referencing that you have to do. A lot of the referencing also comes from where you're filming. So generally you're filming where the documents are, so that makes it a bit easier to see. Radio, it's a bit harder to do the credits in that you can't show them, you would have to say them. But again, you try and reference them where you can, definitely. And within writing, always try and reference. At the end of the day, a lot of the documents are owned by other people. So you need to reference them where you can.
I'd give them credit, presumably, where they've supplied information.
Absolutely. One of the things I used to work on when I was at the National Library of Scotland, I kind of dipped my toe slightly into the whole issue of copyright, which is very interesting. But there are certain estates of literary works who are more generous, shall we say, as to what you can quote and not quote. I had heard of one estate of a poet who had died many, many years ago, about 80, 90 years ago. And someone had published a book and had quoted one line from one of his poems without seeking permission, and the estate sued. So, you do need to be really careful with copyright.
Yes, it's quite a a vexed area, I think. Something that, yeah, it's just when you think you've kind of got a bit of a handle on it, it's not quite as straightforward often. Yes, been there, and sometimes the best you can get is someone giving advice who knows a lot about it. But they can never really say categorically that this is okay or that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, it's very situational, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Who you're doing it on behalf of, where it's going to go, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if there's no further questions, we'll just kind of wrap up. I'll get you to stay in the studio, Ruth. But thank you very much once again. Yes, we're not in the hall, but hopefully people have been able to tune in from all over. As I say, being able to get a glimpse behind the scenes of a television program is certainly not an everyday event. So thank you very much. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
So yeah, if there's no other questions, folks, then I'll just wind up here and just wish everyone a good night, a good evening.